Moving now on to Michael Herzfeld's piece, Law, Courtesy, and the Tactics of Temporality, which I'm taking from Siege of the Spirits. And in it, he is looking at the struggles of a group of people at Pomahakan, which is this old fortress on the edge of old Bangkok. So on the edge of what's called Ratanakosin Island, the old monarchical island in downtown Bangkok. Well, I guess downtown is a misnomer. It's the old city in Bangkok. So there are a few things that need a little bit of clearing up so that you'll understand what it is that he's talking about when he mentions these things, because he talks about these at earlier points in the book, but they have importance for this chapter. So I just want to make sure that these are all clear. The first one is the notion of muang. Now that is sort of an older notion of community that harkens back to a time when the kingdom was made up of what another scholar, Stanley Tambaya, has called a galactic polity. So rather than having sort of a central organization, a central bureaucracy that has power radiating out from it in this sort of uniform way where all power is concentrated in the center, the galactic polity is this idea of different centers of regional power, all of which are in one way or another answerable to the monarch, but that have a great deal of autonomy in their daily lives. So that's where the notion of muang comes from. Muang is also sometimes taken to be city or people. So that the name of the country, Muang Thai, for example, has that built into it, this notion of like the Thai nation. It's not equivalent exactly with the idea of state. And pratet is the word for state or nation state. That's the more bureaucratic notion of a state, and the one that is relevant for what Herzfeld is describing as the Bangkok Municipal Authority, the BMA, throughout this chapter. Finally, Pinong is this relationship of older and younger sibling, P being an elder, Nong being a younger sibling. And while that prevails in the family structure, the kinship structure, it's also a sort of a broad metaphor for relationships of unrelated people, people in the bureaucracy, so that the superior or elder person in the bureaucracy would be P. And when you get to know somebody and develop, so when typically in Thailand, when you address somebody, if you want to be respectful, you use the word kun. So if you wanted to address me very respectfully, you'd call me kun don. Now, at some point, though, when we became close enough that I felt that it was appropriate, that our relationship was one of enough familiarity, then I would invite you to use the term P instead. So that it's not that we become equals, but it's rather that we have a much greater kind of familiarity than the term kun allows. And so this is important then for understanding how Herzfeld is describing the notion of the residents in Pomahakan being like built on the notion of Muang, where there would be a Pinong relationship of familiar older and younger, rather than a very strict, rigid, hierarchized kind of set of relationships, or like any sort of like traditional leader-follower relationship or anything like that. Okay, so then he also talks about segmentation. And this is something that appears in this chapter a lot. So it's worth getting clear what it is that he's talking about, because it's very closely tied to the notion of Meng that he wants to promote as well. So in one of his notes toward the back of the book, he writes that segmentation is minimally a multi-level arrangement of nesting oppositions between opposing factions. In patrilineal systems, this can be represented as a hierarchy of levels at which each of which groups are opposed to each other in feuding relations while coalescing as solidary units at the next level up. So that you can have local conflicts, but when there is a threat from outside the locality, the members of that conflict will enter into a relationship of solidarity with one another to form to go from being two opposing segments to being a single segment that is now standing in opposition to whatever the external threat is. So, what would this look like? I'm taking this example of an apartment building. Now, at the first level, there's my apartment surrounded by white in this diagram. And it's me and my family against the neighbors. So we're in opposition to one another at that first level. But all of us who are on, all of my neighbors who are on my floor, we are going to form a unity against those awful people in the other floor. It's us against them. Okay, so that would be the next level up of segmentation. But all of the people in our building who in the previous slide were battling amongst one another, we would form a still larger solidarity unit against the neighboring building and so forth. So you can see how each one of these, as he says, is nested within the others, so that as you expand out, you get greater and greater ranges of solidarity. But as the external threats that need addressing recede, then that solidarity will break down into opposing factions again. So this is the idea that he has as characteristic of the model of Meng, and that he thinks is characteristic of the residents of Pammahakan. Now, his interest in this book is the community that lives there in an ancient fort, this fort that's on the edge of the Royal Center, Ratanakosin Island, as I said. This community has been slated for removal. They're treated as squatters on this place, and the fort has been slated for a long time to be turned into a park. So a nearby fort connected by a road called Pratsumen, built on the same model, part of the same network of forts, it has been a park, and it has been for a long time. So when I went there for field work in 2002, already this was a park, and it had been for a long time. There's also a pier there, so it's a place where ferries dock to take on and let off people, and so the park is connected to that dock, and so it has been this kind of a public space for a long time. It provides something like a model for what the city had slated for Pammahakan as well. The thing that he wants to work out then is more or less this: that this community, or the residents, it's a question whether they're a community or not. Let's call them a community for now, though. This community has virtually no meaningful power. They have no coercive power. They're not able to exercise violence on anyone. They don't. It's not like they have police of their own or anything like that. The law is not on their side. The law appears decidedly pitted against them. The city and the state bureaucracy are trying to get them out, and they do have coercive agencies at their disposal: the police, the military. And furthermore, the people who lived there were quite poor. So it's not even like they had the kind of political influence that money can buy. So then he wants to know, how on earth is it that they managed for now decades to remain resident within this fort despite all of the pressures that have been organized against them. This chapter then investigates, among other things, I'm going to emphasize the things that are relevant for us. There are other questions of temporality, for example, that he gets into that are less on point for us. So I'm going to mostly pass over those. But this chapter investigates how they were able to make use of specific, what we could think of as cultural techniques, if you want, behavioral traditions, conventions, social conventions, how they could draw on those to forestall the destruction of their community. One of the initial claims he makes then is that the members of the community at Pomahakan are masters of the implicit. So that is this very deft use of indirect hints at sometimes and explicit hints at others. And a lot of this will arise in the way that they use conventions of behavior, of greeting, of demonstrations of respect, and so forth. So then the use of these tactics, especially what he calls the Thai code of manners, is especially important because the claim that the residents stake to the land inside the fort where they live is a moral claim. So they don't really have a good legal claim, in part, large part, because even though they claim title to the land that they're on, the epoch in which they first migrated to and inhabited that land was not one in which you had written deeds or titles to land, so that there's no real paper trail for them to draw on to say, like, look, we've been here for generation upon generation, dating back to this document that gives us title to this land. They don't have that. The way that land ownership and exchange was handled was much less documentary at the time. So this puts them in a legally tenuous position because the law now expects that you back up your claims to a title to land with an actual written title, with a deed that shows that you purchased this land on such and such date and so forth. And they don't have them. So then they're not able to really draw meaningfully on the law to protect them. Rather, he says that they have a more moral claim, grounded in the segmentary logic of the Muang and in claims to represent the quintessence of Thai culture. So that part of their pitch is that they are the embodiment of Thai culture and that their presence at the fort is a way of maintaining and protecting the heritage of Thai culture in the midst of a city, a modern and modernizing city. They are then sort of this preserve of Thai culture. Now, the residents, for their part, they compensate their lack of power with their use of, I just said this, their Thai code of manners. This notion then that they can draw on the everyday and completely familiar and quotidian ways of behaving properly, of being good, upright Thai people who are capable of showing respect in the traditional ways, which means also showing respect to the traditions of respectability. They were able to use this then to sort of prop up the notion that they have a moral claim to this land while simultaneously putting officials on their heels. Not all the time, but this was a tactic that they were able to deploy effectively over a long period. So then among the first things that Herzfeld points out is, even though the stakes are very high for the residents, there are also stakes for the officials. And this especially concerns their personal reputations. So he says that reputation, quote, for the officials at least, might have been a concern of material implications. Regrettably, he doesn't elaborate on what he means by that. He puts it in parentheses and sort of passes it off in the flow of his argumentation without really saying what it is that he means by that. It's more of a hint than an explanation. So what might he mean? Well, we can remember then from my chapter, Experimenting with Fate, that Sané, one of the chair, in fact, of the Human Rights Commission, contested a notion of Buddhism that sustained social inequalities and, by extension, patron-client relations. I think this sort of thing, the patron-client relation, is what Herzfeld has in mind. So bureaucrats' opportunities for advancement in the bureaucracy, in some part, are going to depend on their ability to sustain favor with their superiors, who are going to have something like a relationship of a patron to them. And so the notion of losing face is important here, because if you lose face as a client of someone else, there's this kind of contagion of losing face, so that your patron, the person who stands up for you, who supports you, that patron is also going to lose face in this exchange. So then, if you do things that are embarrassing, that cause you to lose face, that's going to harm those relationships. And it might imperil your relationship of clientage to your patron or to your superiors. Now, also, their ability to become patrons as they advance, as they move up and they're in a position to start cultivating clients of their own, would also be imperiled by their loss of face. So then, I think what Herzfeld has in mind is that patrons have a kind of material interest in preserving their status, preserving their face. Why? Because clients, having a lot of clients, can support their material aspirations either directly or through giving the kind of protection and support that allows you to advance your causes within the bureaucracy, to maneuver more effectively, to confront and outmaneuver opponents within the bureaucracy, and so on. So then personal reputation has material consequences as well. This, I imagine, is what he's pointing to. It's hard to know for sure because he doesn't actually spell it out. Okay, so then there's something curious, though, about the preservation of face. And it means that both sides need to remain attentive to issues of saving face. Not just saving face for yourself, but saving face for even sometimes your opponent. The residents then were looking for ways to stall for time. They figured that the longer that they could maintain their community, avoid eviction, avoid the destruction of their houses, the greater likelihood that they would be able to get the public behind them, that they would be able to get politicians behind them, which to some extent actually did happen with the change of governors to Governor Apirak at one point. He just touches on that in the chapter. He doesn't really go in any detail. But anyway, so to be able to generate this kind of wellspring of support, they needed more time. And so not only did stalling time mean that they would simply be able to be there for longer, but it also improved their future aspirations and the likelihood that they would be able to remain a community indefinitely. So then this would allow them to put pressure on officials with the hopes that eventually officials would relent, or a new dispensation would take over the bureaucracy, and that dispensation would recognize the validity of the claims that the residents made and therefore grant them sort of custodianship of the fort. They approached their conflict with the Bangkok Municipal Authority then by stressing the need to reduce tensions, not to let people get inflamed by the combat with one another, as part of which they included a recognition of the potentially awkward position officials might find themselves in if they weren't able to make any progress on this beautification plan for the fort. So to publicize their struggle, the residents had hung banners inside and outside on the fort walls so that passersby on the street would be able to see them and would be alerted to the fact that there was a community in there that was the legitimate inhabitants of this area and that they were being forced out. The BMA wanted them to remove all of the signage, and so they negotiated and they came to an agreement that they would remove the ones on the street side but not inside, and that would allow the officers to show that they had made some kind of progress, right? That they had an accomplishment to show for all of their work that would sort of satisfy their superiors. It would allow them to save face. They would not be embarrassed. They wouldn't be chagrined. It wouldn't look like they had been outmaneuvered by a group of squatters in the fort. It would preserve their face while at the same time allowing the residents to keep the banners that they had posted inside the walls. And these are still publicly accessible areas, right? So people walking through the fort would still be able to see these placards and banners. It's not like they would be shut off from the public, only shut off from the street side. In effect, what this does is it allows the officials not to lose face. It didn't really cost the residents anything to make this concession, but it avoided the potentially high costs for the officials, and that in turn allows them to be conciliatory. And this is the kind of thing that sustains the struggle, that allows it to continue. Now, the residents were also able to play on these anxieties about reputation and face, and around patronage and one's position within the bureaucracy by claiming to have allies or collaborators in the bureaucracy itself. So then this once again draws on the segmentary notion of the Hmong, in which the bureaucracy, although it's supposed to be this completely rationalized institution, in fact is saturated, sown through with all of the traditional forms of sociality that have prevailed in Thailand, so that it itself has this segmentary quality to it, that there will be different factions within the bureaucracy. And what that means is that if a faction within the bureaucracy is also allied with the residents, then the residents can draw on that solidarity in order to resist other factions within the BMA that do want to carry out this plan. So then making this allegation draws on this tradition of segmentary coalitions or alliances, to set the bureaucrats, set the officers a little bit ill at ease. They can't be certain that this isn't the case. So they can't be certain as they proceed that if they push the case too hard, they're not going to come up against resistance from some faction within the bureaucracy that does have some kind of an allegiance to the residents and therefore could cause problems for them within the bureaucracy. So then there's this maneuvering, even within the structure of the bureaucracy, that the residents are capable of doing by drawing on these very traditions and conventions that are characteristic of the Hmong and the sort of segmentary organization that it has and that persists in the bureaucracy. Herzfeld notes further, though, that when they were engaging with officials, especially when they were in meetings that were sort of contestatory, they could perform the conventional expressions of respect in a very perfunctory way that can also therefore communicate exactly the opposite of respect. So it's like I'm showing simultaneously that I will demonstrate respect by giving a respectful why, nicely demonstrated in the picture below. But I'm going to do it in such a way that I also communicate that, in fact, I personally have no respect for you personally. So then you can communicate disdain while carefully veiling it with an absolutely recognizable display of respect or of courtesy. So this individual who was sort of a leader within the community, a leader who regarded himself as an equal. It's a very interesting alternative to the more hierarchical structure of the bureaucracy. But this figure, Tuatchai, he sort of barely executes this why. So the why, as you see in the picture, it involves the inferior not raising her hands, but in this case, dipping her head further toward her hands, while the superior in the exchange will return the Y, but with the hands at a lower level relative to the head, or rather, more accurately, the head inclined not nearly as far to maintain who's in the dominant and who's in the subordinate position. So when Tuatchai returns the Y, he could do it in this sort of like ambiguous way that is perfunctory. It might be very quickly done. It might be not directed at any particular individual, to communicate both adherence to the convention but also personal disdain. Now, one thing that should be clear, though, is that the employment of these tactics can only buy so much time. And although the officials compromised on that particular day with the removal of the placards and other signs and things, that wasn't the end of the story. And then later that year, the army came in and destroyed not all of the buildings, but a couple of important buildings that they used as meeting centers. And so what it suggests is that these victories that the residents won by this sort of careful deployment of courtesy and these careful maneuvers that they made, more than anything, just slowed the erosion of the community, but didn't actually manage to stop it. But we see something else with the entrance of the army onto the stage of this conflict. There are multiple state agencies involved now. The army, the police, the BMA, an officer from the fine arts department. And they don't all have the same agendas. They don't all align with one another. So take the person from the fine arts department. She lobbied to keep the fort as an archaeological site, as this kind of great repository of Thai traditions dating back hundreds and hundreds of years. That could be rich with examples of the conventional and traditional life of Thai people from well before Bangkok was the metropolitan center that it has now become. And so she was open to entertaining the idea of keeping the residents there as sort of custodians of this space, as they had capably been for at least 150 years. So then you can see that different parts of the state bureaucracy at different levels, city and the state itself, are not necessarily going to be aligned with one another. And this once again lends itself to the notion of a segmentary structure. And it gives more credence to the residents' claims that they have allies in the bureaucracy. So that you can see these things actually acted out within ongoing meetings, which makes it again hard for officials to feel confident that they are just obviously and naturally allied with other officials. So then the BMA, in spite of all that, was the main agency involved. And it was their view of the situation that presented the clearest contrast and conflict for the residents. The residents claimed this kind of collective identity as a community that was heir to a centuries-long settlement of the site. As I say, at least 150 years. While the BMA saw them not as a community, not as a collectivity, but as individual households who had really little or more likely no legal claim to the sites on which their houses rested. And so the BMA's view was that these individuals should be pushed out because as individuals they could not demonstrate a legal claim to the places they inhabited. So then we get, on the one hand, this collective, communal, and moral claim to land pitted against this individualizing, bureaucratized denial of claims to land. It's worth noting, though, that the divergence of perspectives is long-standing. This is not something that just cropped up in the 2010s when Herzfeld was there doing his research, but dated back at least to the 1950s when the government had also planned to sweep aside the entire community in a beautification project. So Herzfeld writes, as a bureaucratic institution representing a subdivision of the nation state, the BMA based its arguments on a paper trail and on the absence of documentation on the community's side. The community, by contrast, appealed to concepts of collective cultural inheritance, as well as to the evidence that they had already demonstrated their attachment to and care for an important site that also happened to be of great national historical importance. And you can see then why that latter part would appeal to the officer from the Fine Arts Department, but that it might not cut so much ice with the BMA because they had a different notion of what preserving the Thai patrimony would be about. It was about building a park on this beautiful site in a city that badly needed park space, which actually is true. And that bureaucratic priority and that project of beautification trumped any of these sort of squatters' rights to the land. That's the BMA view. Now, conventions of face patronage and politeness were not the only cultural resources available to the residents. They could also draw on long-standing beliefs about spirits inhabiting the land and on Buddhism and engage in symbolic behavior around these notions, so that they invited monks to come and make merit offerings to the site's ancestral spirits. So the notion here is that spirits inhabit the land. It's often referred to as an animist belief. And this is widespread in Thailand. So throughout the country, you'll see these little houses, and you'll see people put them on their property, and they are, when they move onto a piece of land, they, in recognition of the spirits that live there, provide them with a house. And so you get these small houses. They'll make offerings to them. You can see that they have garlands, they have lotuses, they've got incense. Very often they'll leave fruit there as well to give respect to the spirits and to give them a place where they can sustain themselves. So then, by having the monks come and make merit toward these spirits, they're combining these two major belief systems in Thailand, the spirit beliefs and Buddhism, as a way of sort of bolstering their moral claim to the land, but also of demonstrating their tie to bad choice of word, their connection, let's say, their connection to this long-standing set of traditions and beliefs that are absolutely characteristic of Thainess. And that these are the sorts of things then that will have a kind of resonance with the public. Members of the public will look on these things and immediately recognize them, immediately feel a certain kind of connection to them, immediately feel drawn to the residents who are undertaking these things, engaging in this kind of symbolic activity. Symbolic victories in the mobilization of cultural conventions, however, do not prevent legal losses. And so even as the Human Rights Commission interjected into the dispute, they couldn't even manage to forestall the BMA's legal claims. And so the BMA, when things went to court, the BMA would typically win. They would prevail because the law was on their side. This took another aspect with disputes over what made a real community, when the BMA raised doubts about whether the residents at the fort actually constituted a community. So you can imagine people who get onto a subway car in Manhattan to travel wherever, it's a group of people, they're all in one place, but they don't constitute a community. It's just a random group of people. Now, if events should unfold that maybe the train gets stalled in a tunnel, or there's some kind of an event that brings everybody in that car together, they might wind up forming a community of some kind. But it's not because they start off that way. And so what distinguishes a community and simply a group of people who happen to be in the same place is crucial here. The BMA is not persuaded that the residents form a community. And they draw on a kind of official definition of community in order to arrive at this, and it's organized around this idea of traditional commerce. What does that mean? It means that on the official view, the residents of Mahakam Fort wanted to claim that they were a community. Fine, but then they had to show the unique commercial product that they made that was characteristic of that community, and therefore not just something that was available wherever. So then what do we see here? We see that community on this definition is not a question of established or enduring social relations, but of material production. It's sort of congealed in a thing. And this was consistent with the idea of community that appears in other government programs. So he cites the One Tambon, One Product government project in which a tambon, which is a district. So each district would make the thing that is characteristic of that district, and that's how they would sort of emblematize themselves and materialize their notion of community in this particular object, usually serving the tourist industry. And that's sort of the kind of very commercial material notion of culture, of community that they have. So then, given the way that the residents had pinned their hopes on establishing a moral claim as a community to the land, calling into question their integrity as a community was an especially threatening move. So again, the notion of segmentary community pops up. And this is important for Herzfeld. He points out that the officials claimed that the existence of factions among the residents show that they cannot be a community. So that they have this idea that a community must be completely unified, without factions, without disputes, without internal rifts, in order to be a community. The segmentary notion, as we were discussing at the top, doesn't hold to this view at all. Rather, the segmentary notion has it that factions come together in times of opposition from other forces and then return to opposition later when they are when that external threat has dissipated. And they would say we see this throughout Thai history. But we could also just note that in any in any sort of organization, a community, a bureaucracy, an athletics team, it doesn't matter. There will always be factions. So that this notion of community that they're drawing on as symbolized by a particular commercial product is not one that bears up well to reality. So then, in a curious way, both the residents and the BMA maneuver around a shared notion of community on the model of an ancient rural poor farming community. That's sort of the imaginary ideal of the Thai community. In both of their views, this is a community made up of a cluster of kin. Right, so a small village that's a cluster of kin, farmers related to one another. Okay, so then the residents on their side claim that they're the contemporary embodiment of this sort of very traditional ideal community. They are in but not of their urban setting. They harken back to a different time. The BMA on its side argues that if, as seems to be the case, people have come from elsewhere to settle among the residents, then they can't meet this definition as a cluster of kin. So you have opposing approaches to this kind of shared notion of what a community would be. And the implications are serious. Herzfeld writes, denying the reality of the residents' claims to share a way of life, this is what the residents claim, strikes at the very heart of their moral claims on the right to remain on the site. At its largest scale, then, we can see the conflict sort of from the 10,000 foot view. We can see the conflict as this clash between two mutually exclusive views. The imperatives of pratet, of the modern bureaucratized state on the one side, and on the other, the moral claims of the Hmong, this segmentary sort of national identity identified with the traditional community, which would also be segmentary in nature. The residents' solidarity, Herzfeld points out, grows from the latter identity and grows because it's segmentary from the threat that they all collectively share from the BMA, right? That has a unifying impact on them. The BMA, on its side, denies the relevance of that very identity in the face of law, government policy, and development projects, right? So that it's about policy imperatives upheld by the law. But perhaps the most unexpected thing of all is the force and resiliency that the segmentary Muang model has provided for the residents. So then their ability to employ conventions and discourses of Thai tradition has been so effective, partly because of their immediate familiarity, their resonance, their sort of visceral impact to Thai people of all walks of life, right? They can feel this immediate connection to this community because of their proximity to an ideal of Thai communality. But then also because the very officials who wish to carry out the bureaucratic duties, they're also caught in the same conventions and traditions, even within the bureaucracy, that has patron-client relations sewn through it and on whose future they completely depend, right? That their future success as bureaucrats depends on their attentiveness to these conventional forms of sociality. So they have resonance at all of these different levels, in spite of the fact that the residents have no real power of their own. So the flip side of the residents' use of conventional forms of courtesy with officials, which they use to great effect, is the threat to officials if they should opt to use force to eject the residents. That is, responding with force to people who have been rigorously courteous in the most traditional and conventional of ways would humiliate the officials and demonstrate their incapacity to reach a peaceful resolution with otherwise powerless people. It would be a kind of loss of face for them. Indeed, it would only serve to confirm the residents' self-presentation of respectability, righteousness, and present the BMA not as a legitimate rational agency, but as a kind of authoritarian regime, the sort of thing that has been the bane of Thai politics for virtually all of its modern history. Now, the story that Herzfeld tells is one of resilience and perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds. And up to the time that the book was published in 2016, they persisted. The sad news for them is that within 2 years of the publication of this book, so in 2018, in the spring of 2018, their struggle finally lost its wind. And their houses were cleared, the BMA prevailed, and their homes were destroyed. So the sort of triumphant story that Herzfeld has been telling in the book regrettably does not continue beyond the end of the book. That's a story that came to, for them, the somewhat tragic end of losing their community, losing their homes, losing the site that they had lived on for 150 years. So on that unhappy note, we reached the end of this.